Let me get started. Um, what I don't have here is anything really on my background. Let me just say that quickly. I pay the bills doing hands-on evaluation. And when I do that, I'm very mixed methods and eclectic. Someone says, we have this program, how does it work and what's happening? I sort of jump on it, and any methodology, quantitative, qualitative, experimental, quasi-experimental, you know, whatever it is, I say, okay, where's the data, what can I do? So it's a very practical way of viewing the world. But I also have this other existence, which is really contributing to evaluation theory. For lack of, it's not a word I like, but I suppose it's a legitimate term. And I do two things with that. One is do a lot on unintended consequences, and that relates also to program theory and logic modeling and nature of systems. And the other part of my sort of intellectual existence is actually to run computer simulations to try to use principles of complex adaptive systems to try to understand how you can understand how programs work and use those as evaluation tools. That stuff is way out. Nobody uses it. I don't know if anybody ever will, but it's all very interesting. And if anybody wants to see a demo of that someday, happy to do it. But in any case, we should talk about what we're doing here. And this is based on my work dealing with unintended consequences. And frankly, one of the things I find is that when I do work for clients, I never mention any of this stuff. But it's clear to me that what I know about it has a real effect on what I tell them and what I do. So it tends to work out pretty well. And the truth is I never would have been able to figure any of this stuff out if I didn't do a lot of hands-on practical evaluation. So things really do work pretty well together. What I don't have here is an overview slide, for which I apologize. So let me just go through that quickly, because that'll give you some sort of cognitive structure of what we're going to go through, and maybe you'll get a little bit less lost. Well, let's keep that for the moment. Basically, I'm going to talk about what the problem is. Then I'm going to give you some examples of how this might work in a development context. Now, I have to tell you now, I made these examples up, and they're deliberately simple, because if you have big, complicated examples, it's very hard to illustrate points. So I don't mean to imply that these are sort of real cases that any of you would actually deal with, but I tried to make them close enough to something you would recognize that I could then build some points on them. So I'll go through some examples. Then I'll talk a little bit about what my real objective here is, and that's to get people to think about this problem. Then what I'll do is go through a summary of all the methods that I think might work for dealing with unintended consequences. Then I'll go back to those examples and I'll apply them. Now, I have to tell you, I don't know if you read the paragraph describing this talk, but what I can tell you is when I said there's no magic bullet, I meant it. I am not going to tell you anything and you can say, oh my God, we can go out and solve all our problems. That is not going to happen. I mean, if I could do that, I'd be rich and retired. So that's not going to happen. But I do think you can chip away at the problem. You know, you can make it less serious. You can get a handle on it. And all the techniques we're going to talk about are not esoteric. Either you've used them, or if you haven't used them, you know people who've used them. It's not as if I'm going to talk about some, I don't know, new method of weighting factors in a factor analysis, or some new approach to categorizing open-ended data using some software that nobody's ever used before. And this is all going to be very practical. You're going to recognize all the methods. The real issue is how do you put them all together, and that's really what we're going to talk about. So let's next. There we go. Wow, it really worked. Fantastic. Okay. This issue of unexpected consequences and why they exist. I'm not going to go into a big lecture on complex adaptive systems, but actually, no, I will not do that. I'd be happy to, there's another time. But the point is the world is complex, and I don't mean complex in a colloquial sense. I mean complex in a formal sense. And that's why we have these problems. That's why when you implement the program, it behaves in ways you didn't expect, it does things that you didn't expect. And there's some deep roots for this. Issues of network effects, right? All probably come up with examples where you have nodes in some network of a system you're evaluating, you get these interactions amongst them, and all of a sudden things go haywire. There are power law distributions. That's sort of the Pareto 80-20 rule. But what that really means is that no matter how good you are at implementing programs, a very small percentage are going to be effective, and most are going to be either not effective or minimally effective. And that makes it very difficult to think about what's really going to happen. There are bifurcation points. I won't get into the technicalities, but you get to a certain point in a program's development or a system's development, and all of a sudden things go off in different directions. And there are technical and mathematical reasons for that, which again I won't get into, but I'm sure you've had situations like that where something happens, it seems to be small, things go off in a totally different direction. That's not just because the world is perverse. That's because these things actually exist in the world, and they are a function of complex systems. I have some great demos of that if anybody wants to see it. There are uncertain and evolving environments, right? I mean, you drop a program, you drop an initiative into some setting, and you have to assume at least some kind of stability. Well, and as we all know, things aren't always stable, and so when the environment around the program evolves, programs begin to do things that you hadn't expected to. Feedback loops, it's related to network effects. And I could go on and on, I'm not going to. All I want to do is sort of give you the sense that there is this notion of complex behavior. It is a formal as well as a colloquial sense to it, and that there's no escaping it. And there are good reasons why these things happen, and if we're smart and clever, we can do better, but the idea that you can make them go away is like saying that you can violate the rules of gravity. You can't. Now, truth of the matter is that no matter how uncertain the world is, no matter how uncertain your programs are, no matter how strange they seem to act in terms of the effects that they have, there's a guaranteed solution. You will never have a problem. Right? That's in the upper right. You have post-test only, treatment group only, unstructured data collection. Right? You will never have a problem because the program seems to have some consequences you didn't expect, so you go ahead and ask different questions. It doesn't matter. Right? You can always do that. The problem is that you lose an awful lot of powerful evaluation tools. You can't do any kind of time series. You have no comparison groups. A lot of evaluations, have surveys and interview protocols that you've put some work into developing, validating, right? You don't have those. This issue of time series is not just a quantitative issue. I have a friend who was, in fact, this is sort of a case in the book, I think, where they were evaluating a program, and it was a qualitative study, and it had to do with refugee resettlement, and the plan was to interview people when they first got to the resettlement camps, and interview at particular times going into the future. That's a qualitative time series analysis. And what nobody bothered to tell them is that the evaluation began 6 months after the program, after people got resettled. It's not that they didn't ask, nobody bothered to tell them. Well, if you think about it, they lost the baseline group, right? It's a qualitative study, it's not a qualitative issue, but they lost the baseline study. So the problem is that if you just say, we're going to interview people, no control groups, post-test only, you can get a lot of good data, by the way. I'm not against those designs all necessarily, but it means that you lose an awful lot of power in your evaluations. And why do we lose these things? Well, it takes time to set up an evaluation methodology. You don't just turn these things on a dime. It takes effort, right? It takes money. Right? It takes a lot of negotiation. I can't imagine any of you have done an evaluation without a fair amount of negotiation. Can we interview people? Can we get access to data? Can we get a look at the records that you have, whatever it might be? So you've gone through all these negotiations, and all of a sudden the program acts in a strange way, and you're going to say, well, we need a new set of negotiations now because we were going to interview these people, we got permission to do it, now we need to interview those people. Well, you can't. Sometimes you can do that, and often you can't because you're not set up to do it. So when these surprises hit, you lose the ability to use a lot of these evaluation methodologies because what do the economists call it? Sunk cost, is that the word for it? You've already put the time, the effort, the money, intellectual energy into it. You can't just turn these things on a dime. And that is why when programs begin to behave unexpectedly and have doesn't meet it's not a problem if they behave unexpectedly. The problem is if by behaving unexpectedly they have outcomes you hadn't planned to look at, or even if they behave the way they're supposed to and they have outcomes you didn't plan to look at. And that's when you get into trouble. Okay. Come on. Next. There we go. So what I'm going to do now is lay out a couple of examples here, and then I'm going to carry them through. Now, as I said, don't laugh at me, guys, because these are deliberately simple examples, but I think that they're close enough to things you've brushed up against that you could say, I can kind of recognize that. So the first example I have is where you're giving free or reduced fees for postnatal services. It's a nice program, and this is based on a real case, I know, by the way. And you've got some outcomes that you're looking for in the evaluation, right? You're going to do the methodology, right? You use surveys and interviews. You're going to look at health indicators for mothers and children, and you got a variety of child development indicators. Seems pretty clear, right? Better postnatal care, kids are going to do better, mothers are going to do better. It's all very nice. Well, there are some unexpected outcomes here. Drug and supply hoarding, right? The people involved in this program know that programs come and go, right? So they're going to hoard drugs. This is the only one, by the way, that's not made up. This is real. Drug hoarding, things you didn't expect. New sets of informal fees, right? Because in lots of parts of the world, as you well know, there are informal fees, and people, I mean, that's how people live. So new fees get put into place. And then, of course, you get lower than expected use of the services, right? So now you're getting these various unexpected outcomes. Now, whether they should really be unexpected or not, or whether anybody who knew anything about the subject would have said, how come you didn't prepare to look at that? That is a separate question, and we will get into that soon. But what are the weaknesses in the evaluation? Well, there are no interviews or observations to estimate the actual number of fees. There's no way to correlate the fees with the attendance or client characteristics. So if these things begin to happen, your methodology isn't in a position to tell you anything about it. So that's the first example. These other two examples I absolutely totally made up, I have to admit. Improving agricultural yield, right? The use of fertilizers or crop rotation, whatever it happens to be. What's the methodology? You look at existing records, because there are actually records on crop yields that you can use. You're going to interview people, you're going to observe how they do their farming practices and so on and so forth. The outcomes are pretty straightforward. You're going to look at yield, you're going to look at the system, the cost of the new system, because there's a cost-benefit analysis here. If it costs too much, the fact that you're getting better agricultural yield isn't going to help you that much. So you're going to look at that. And you look at issues of profit, right? Because we're assuming not subsistence farming here. And so we're assuming that you're actually contributing to a market economy. And so it's one thing to say, what's the cost-benefit? It's another thing to say, but look, are people actually taking home more money? So, okay, it's a pretty reasonable set of outcomes. What's unexpected? Perverse effects of increased wealth disparity, right? Actually, this is a real example someone told me about. In a particular location, it increased the degree of polygamy in the community. If you think about it, polygamy is expensive. If all of a sudden people are doing better economically and there's disparity of wealth anyway, you might in fact perturb the community that way. So actually, I didn't make that one up entirely. I didn't write about it in the book, but someone told me about it. I can't tell you who. In any case, this is a real example. Well, what are the weaknesses in the evaluation? Well, you don't have any control groups. I guess I shouldn't use the word control group because that has a sort of baggage attached to it. But there are no other communities that you can use as comparisons in a situation like this. You might very well like to, because there might be sort of general effects of other programs that are increasing wealth in many communities. This issue of polygamy might be cutting across many communities, and who knows what's going on. And so having some kind of comparison communities would be a good idea. Well, if you think about it, how are you going to get them, right? If you thought you needed them at the beginning of the evaluation, you probably would have figured out a way to set it up. It's not that hard, in a way. But if you're in the middle of the evaluation, there's time, there's money and all that, you you can't just go and look at this stuff. I mean, sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And of course, there are no interviews in this little design of mine to check on the consequences of the disparities. You don't have any sense of what's the social structure of this community, what's likely to happen when income disparities increase, right? Or given what I know about how agriculture is done in this community, to what degree will increasing agricultural yield increase income disparity? Because it may or may not, it's not a guaranteed thing. But your evaluation isn't set up to do it. So that's the next example. The third example is improving access to primary education. Again, the outcome data is pretty straightforward. You're going to look at school records, you're going to survey parents, you're going to survey kids, you're going to look at attendance, you're going to look at graduation rates, and let's say you actually have a somewhat long-term view of this, so you can follow kids for a couple of years at least. You can actually look at life trajectories. Right? That's pretty cool design. I like that. Well, what are the unexpected outcomes? Well, one is that you could think about this school attendance case as a contribution to the building of civil society, along with helping business groups and infrastructure and whatever else you happen to be doing, right? And we know that interactions amongst different parts of civil society can have profound effects on a community. But you're not measuring any of that stuff, and so you begin to see these effects, but you don't know what to do about it from a methodological point of view. The other issue is that there are networking effects amongst these connections, and so you can think about civil society as network development, which we will, and sort of each effort to develop civil society as a node in a network, if you want to think of it in those terms. And as these nodes develop, people don't live in isolation from each other. You begin to get interactions, connections among these nodes. Well, that's really powerful stuff, right? But it's nowhere in your evaluation. You have no census of other civil society projects in the province, in the community, in the country, whatever else you're working on. You certainly have no data on the interaction among those projects, and you have no data on the consequences of the interaction. Right? And so here you have an example where, yes, you can look at attendance, graduation, life trajectory, and that's a good thing to do. But one of the real advantages of this program might be contributing to this network development of civil society. It's conceivable, I suppose, that that's more important than actually working with the kids, but you have no data on it. It's a black box. So I've made up these examples. Okay, so we're going to work on them in a little bit and show you how we deal with it. All this stuff I'm going to say, and all this stuff I've been writing about, the one thing, I keep forgetting, let's go to the next one, sorry about that. There we go. I'm not trying to say, take Johnny's advice, think about all these things you can do with unintended consequences and forget about everything else. You design an evaluation, there's lots of stuff you deal with. You look at the funding, you look at your deadlines. Whoops. Okay. You look at your fundings, you look at whatever combination of logic models and program theory that you're developing. You think about measurement, you think about your research design, we care about information use. And one of the things you think about is who's going to use the data and when I'm going to need it and how am I going to pitch that information. What's my role as an evaluator? What's the logistics of implementing the evaluation, right? We think of all this stuff. My only point is that this issue of unintended consequences, or what I sometimes like to call evaluation surprise, all I want is for people to add it into the mix. Right? And I don't think that people can or should use that as the sole criteria. The way I see it is that design, I guess maybe I've been hanging out with too many engineers in my life, but the way I see designing an evaluation is that it's a challenge of sort of jointly optimizing a set of design criteria. Right? You have money, time, the rigor of data that you're going to need, the windows of opportunity for giving people information when they can use it. These are all design criteria. Right? And what you really need to do is to jointly optimize the design criteria. So my only point is throw this issue into the mix. Okay, so now that I've set you up for all that, what I want to do is give you a quick overview of what the methods are. I promise not to talk about all of them, but we'll go through a couple of examples, and when I do that, I will draw on these three examples that I just gave you. So let us do that. And as I said, if people have questions, just haul off and ask them. Okay. Here's the way I look at this. Okay, the way I see it is that you can think of a continuum, and on one side of the continuum are consequences that are foreseeable if only you went to law. There's some line in my book that says something like, there's nothing so trite as recommending old-fashioned literature review, but it's a good idea anyway. You know, the number of people who don't do that amazes me. And this example of the fees, you know, the friend of mine who did this evaluation, she was called in the middle and she said to me, Johnny, I could have told him what would happen. And it wasn't just me, apparently, I didn't know this, but there are a lot of people with a lot of experience in these kinds of programs, and they know what happens in terms of the informal fees and so on. So this is a great surprise. But they didn't bother to look. And that's why I said originally that there's nothing I'm going to tell you that's exotic. There's no methodology, and I almost feel like I'm wasting everybody's time to say, well, look into these things at the beginning, except that people don't. I've never gotten it. But the point is, at one end of this continuum are things that you can foresee, and so I decided a checkerboard would be a good way to show that. At the other end of the continuum are things that are unforeseeable. And when I mean unforeseeable, what I mean is not that we're not smart enough, not that we haven't done enough of literature review, not that we haven't interviewed enough people, but they are actually impossible, and that's because they actually come out of complex systems dynamics. And I promise not to give a big lecture on that, but hopefully you get some intuitive sense that complex systems generate unpredictable kinds of activities. And by the way, that picture on the upper right, that's a drunkard's walk, aka a random walk. That's what it's called. It's called the drunkard's walk, actually. I stole that picture from Wikipedia. I figured I needed some kind of image to show this sort of random behavior, and drunkard's walk seemed good enough to me, so there it is. Now, by the way, I could also give you a lot of explanation as to why this continuum is actually not right. Right? It sort of makes an assumption about linear change across a unidimensional continuum that really doesn't exist in the world. But it works, so we're going to pretend that it's there, pretend that it's real. So at the foreseeable end, what are the kinds of things you can do? Here are issues of program theory. Right? Theory helps you understand what might happen. We're going to give an example of that. Limiting time frames, you can. I don't really recommend that one because you end up with trivial evaluations, but you can do it. You know, I mean, if you're doing an evaluation, you don't want to say, well, no, what's going to happen 3 years in the future. You're much more likely to get unanticipated consequences than if you say you only care about what's going to happen 1 year in the future. So I have to put that in there, but as I said, obviously has some real disadvantages because you do care about what happens in the long run. And then exploiting past experience, right? This example I gave you with the user fees, right? She said to me, people in this business know what's going to happen, right? And yet, they don't ask. So, those are the kinds of things that work at the foreseeable end. Let me jump to the other end, then we'll talk about the middle. At the unforeseeable end, one of the things you can do is what I call retooling program theory. You say, well, we really thought the program was going to act in such and such a way and going to do A, B, C, but it actually acted in a different way. So, but now that I see my data, I'm going to understand that the program actually worked according to a different program theory, at which point a different set of outcomes makes sense, and you reanalyze the data. And it seems silly, but people do this, and it works. Do I have time for another quick example? I guess I do. This guy was doing an evaluation of, this is not a development example, it happened I think in Boston, but he was looking at the ratio of kids in daycare to caregivers. And the idea is that this ratio is supposed to have an effect on all kinds of developmental aspects of the kids. Well, there was a bit of a problem, which is that for economic reasons he couldn't have too many caregivers. And I think this was Massachusetts, there were state laws about the maximum size of the groups that you could have in child care. So if you think about it, you had this extremely restricted range. And you know, we know what happens when you do a regression analysis when you restrict the range of things. So they tried everything they could not find any results. So finally this guy said, another friend of mine said, well, you know, let's forget about the ratio. Let's just look at the number of kids in the groups. At which point he found all kinds of very worthwhile effects that he could talk about, really important kinds of findings. He basically retooled the program theory. He said, well, this program does not producing the kinds of results that we expected. Let's pretend that it was never really about the ratio, but simply the absolute number, at which point they were able to show that all kinds of effects that they were seeing were in fact functions of the number of kids in groups. So retooling program theory. It's a little difficult because you've pitched a particular program theory and you've got something funded based on that program theory, but doesn't mean you can't do it, and it sometimes can help a lot. Agile methodology. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but there are ways of taking methodology, even rigorous methodology, and making it more flexible. And I'll talk about some examples of that later on. There are problems in doing it, by the way, but it does have its advantages. And finally, there are issues of data choices. If you think about this, for instance, if you're going to use a psychometrically validated survey of some, doesn't matter what, I don't know, kids' motivation to go to school, whatever you want to call it. If you're really going to validate a survey to do that, you've got a survey that's validated, and you've done factor analysis and Cronbach's alpha, and you've got a whole bunch of clean scales, and it's all very nice, but you can't change that stuff very easily. On the other hand, you can interview kids about whether they like to go to school. Might not be nearly as good a measure, but it's flexible. Right? So you have these kinds of choices. So now let's talk about the middle. Because the fact of the matter is that that's where most of the action is. I'm a big believer in increasing lead time. If I knew 6 months in advance that I needed a comparison group that I didn't have, I'd probably be able to negotiate access to a comparison group. If I knew a month in advance that I would need a comparison group that I didn't have, it would probably be impossible for me to do it. In fact, I know it's impossible because I've had this problem and I failed utterly at it. So lead time matters. And so we'll talk about how you increase the lead time of coming to the suspicion that you need to retool your methodology to measure program consequences that you didn't think about before. And then systems-based logic modeling, and we'll talk about that as well. So we can now look at an example. By the way, if you ever need to do things like this, stealing from Wikipedia is great, because all of those images are in the public domain. You don't have to worry about it. So that's why I just did a long blog post on my blog, and all the pictures came from Wikipedia for that reason. Okay, so we're going to look at this example. Right? Notice I grayed out, or I actually eliminated everything in the middle and the end. We're going to look at how you can deal with theory as a way of understanding unintended consequences. And this is something you can do in the beginning. Okay, and we're going to show you how that works. If I can use the computer, I will. Next. Cool. Okay. So you should recognize that example from up on top, right? That's the example of helping kids go to school. And if you remember, the original notion was that the outcome is going to be attendance and graduation and life trajectory. The problems we have is that this is really one way of contributing to civil society. We believe that by adding to the network of civil society, you might have all kinds of non-specific education-related effects, hopefully good things, although not guaranteed, but I mean, hopefully good things. There's a lot of political science research to show that these are good things to happen. And the weakness of the design is that you don't have a census of other groups, you don't have data on interactions, and so on. Well, let's talk about theory, okay? Anybody ever actually done anything with networks? No, okay. If you look at that curve on the bottom, you do a thought experiment. Take a bunch of buttons, throw them on the floor, scatter them randomly, pick two at random, tie a thread between them. Pick one up, the other button's going to pick up. Pick another two randomly, tie a thread between them. For a while, each time you pick up a thread, only two buttons are going to move, right? But eventually, buttons will connect to buttons, and so you're going to pick up the new thread, and a few buttons will move, right? This is increasing edges among nodes in the network. Well, what will happen is that you're going to get more and more edges, with very little change in the number of buttons that are going to get picked up until you hit a critical time, right? And that's what those inflection points are. You hit that critical time, and all of a sudden, just a few more threads, and the whole thing is connecting. You pick it up, and the whole thing goes up. That's a theory. It has to do with the way networks work in this world. And so what we're saying is, look, we're helping kids go to school, but we're also contributing to network development, and we know how networks behave. At which point, you might say in your evaluation, when you put it together, what are you going to know? You need to identify other civil society programs. Now, whether you can define a civil society program and find them, is a whole other question, but let's pretend that you can, right? You want some data to measure connections. Now, again, how you actually operationalize that is, I don't mean to make this sound easy, right? Operationalizing the notion of measuring a connection between two different civil society programs is not the easiest thing in the world, but presumably you could do it. You would ignore the details of the programs that are connected, right? If you think about this example of mine, you're randomly connecting nodes. Doesn't matter which ones are connected. Makes that life a little bit easier. And it will also tell you need to collect data fairly frequently, because you can get nothing, 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 a little bit, a little bit, a little bit, bang, big change, right? And then it's going to level out. So if you want to understand when that's going to happen, that drives some decisions around the frequency of data collection, right? So here's an example where by applying theory, can we go back? Yeah, by applying theory early on in here, as we did here, whoops, next, sorry about that. There it is, okay. You're actually able to build some aspects, some designs into your evaluation that will let you measure things that may well happen. So again, this happens at the beginning, but if you use the right theory, you can say, I think these kinds of things are going to happen, instead of being surprised by them. This is not exotic stuff. I'm not telling you anything that's exotic. Because what I'm interested in is stuff that people can do, not stuff that people can't do. Although exotic methodologies are very interesting, but not all that useful all the time. Okay, so now here's another example, right? This is an example from the middle of the continuum. And we're going to talk about forecasting and program monitoring as a way of dealing with this problem of lead time. That's actually a picture of the oracle at Delphi there in the bottom. And as I said, the trick is to do a little better than the Delphic oracle. And that's what we're going to try to do. So, another picture I stole, probably from Wikipedia because it's in the public domain. Is that it? Yes. Right. So again, if you remember the example of agricultural yield, we were going to look at yield, we were going to look at the systems cost, we were going to look at profit. What are the possible unexpected outcomes was this notion of the perverse effects of increased wealth disparities. The weaknesses in the evaluation design is you don't really have any kind of comparison groups, you don't have any qualitative interviewing to really get some sense of what's going on there. So what's the redesign? Well, the redesign is to take a whole community perspective, right? You identify a wide range of social indicators, not necessarily ones directly related to your program. You identify a diverse set of key informants, because if you've got, not every informant can deal with every indicator, right? And you conduct, this is the most important thing, regular open-ended interviewing, right? And this is this notion of, what did I call it? Forecasting. It's really, it's a program monitoring kind of thing. Usually, when I do program monitoring, and I assume when you guys do program monitoring, it's sort of an internal view of the world. This is how it's almost like an engineering control theory view, right? This is how it's supposed to work. Here are the critical parameters and what it's supposed to work, and we're going to monitor and make sure that happens. I'm in favor of that, by the way. Everybody should do that. But what I'm arguing is that you can think of the entire system and monitor the entire system in a qualitative, open-ended way. And if you do that, you're going to then begin to pick up on these kinds of issues. So let's say that you begin to pick up on the notion that polygamy is increasing, or let's say you're beginning to pick up on the fact that there are tensions building in the community between the haves and the have-nots, right, or whatever it might be. If you do that early enough, you can then begin to build in some methodologies that will allow you to deal with it. Right, so if let's say there's increasing tension in the community between the haves and the have-nots, that might again tell you to do certain kinds of qualitative interviewing. It might tell you to look at certain quantitative data on household income, which you might not have thought of to look at before. So whatever it is you might decide to do, but none of this stuff is easy or cheap. We'll go do a bunch of extra interviews. I don't know about you, but he's told me that in the middle of an evaluation I wouldn't be able to do it, or go analyze all this quantitative data on income disparities in the community. By the way, you're 3/4 of the way through the evaluation, and you've got an evaluation team that's not equipped to do that kind of an analysis. You've got no more money to hire consultants. If you had the money for the consultants, you wouldn't be able to find them in time, and right, and on and on and on. So you can't just go ahead and do that. But if you put this system-based M&E into place, so basically expanding what we all do anyway, all of a sudden you're increasing the lead time. Now, if the lead time increases, does that guarantee that you can solve your problem? Obviously not. But the more time you have, the more time you have to use a little bit less of this consultant, so you can use someone else, cut down a little bit on this interviewing, so you can do a little bit more of this. I mean, we all know sort of how to do these things. It's just that it takes time to make it happen. So I'm a great believer in increasing lead time. So that's that example. And as I said, I could give you gazillions of examples for everything on this continuum, but I'm not going to do that because we'll be here all day. I don't want to do that. So now let's look at the third choice here. How am I doing on time? Not too bad. Let's look at the third choice. Whoops. I'm missing a slide here. I'll have to wait. No, I'm not missing a slide. It's everything I need. Cool, okay. So if you remember this third example had to do with giving women free and reduced care, prenatal care. And by the way, the original program was free, but I had to sort of change it to free and reduced to make it more interesting. But since it's all made up, I can use whatever synthetic example I need to illustrate a point. So the original design, you're going to look at health indicators for the child, health indicators for the mother. You're going to look at child development indicators. Totally reasonable. That's what I would do, and I guarantee that's what everybody else here would do. Possible unexpected outcomes, right? This issue of supply hoarding, new sets of informal fees. All of this is lower than expected service use. I didn't put in here what the consequences were of drug hoarding for how people actually self-administer health care. There's probably all kinds of interesting stuff to look at there. It might be worth looking at. The weaknesses in the design, there's no interview or observation to estimate what the real amount of fees are. All you know is they seem to be increasing. Is it a lot? Is it a little? Is it for some people? Is it for other people? What does that mean for reducing the cost of health care and so on? And you can't correlate fees with attendance or client characteristics because you never bothered to try, okay? So what could you do? Right now we're talking about kind of an agile evaluation. You could add a process component to the evaluation design, right? And you could say, we're going to survey mothers to assess the total cost of services. That's not an outcome issue, that's a process evaluation issue, right? You're giving women access to health care. Sometimes it's going to be free, sometimes it's going to be reduced cost, but you don't really know how many services a woman needs and how often she's going to get and which services. So you don't really have good data on what her real costs are, right? But knowing that can make a real difference in understanding what this program is doing. You could add that component. You could do open-ended interviews with clinic staff, right? The consequences of the new system for their work lives. People aren't crazy, they're not irrational. Everyone's trying to do a good job. Everyone's trying to act in good faith. I always assume that until somebody proves otherwise to me. And so when these informal fees develop, it's for a good reason, right? So getting some understanding of that might help a lot in understanding what kinds of outcomes you're getting that were unexpected. So what I've really suggested here is changing the evaluation design. And it sounds like a pretty cool idea, except I had a couple of different kinds of advice. Do you want to do one change in the research design? Do you want to do both? You need to add these questions to all kinds of other questions you're going to ask people, and there's a question budget, right? So on the one hand, you can make the evaluation design more agile, more able to be adjusted in the face of circumstances. On the other hand, you're giving something up, right? And so the message here, and actually it's a message for all of the examples I gave you, is it all sounds like great advice, but doing any of it has opportunity costs. In fact, somewhere in my book I have this whole decision tree which says, this is all great stuff, but don't do too much of it, because here's how you're going to get into trouble if you do too much of it. So my point is that you can make evaluations more agile, but you lose something. You could say we are not going to use psychometrically validated questionnaires, but you lose something by just doing observations and interviews. You could say we are going to very specifically use these control groups, these comparison communities, and we're going to do everything we can to maintain the integrity of those control groups. Or what you can say is, we'll give that up and do a time series analysis instead. Well, the time series analysis is easier because you can use existing data and you can go back in the records. Getting real-time data from comparison groups is a big, expensive kind of deal. You can't just change that easily. It's probably a better design to use the comparison groups, but you're building in rigidity that you wouldn't have before. And so there's a trade-off between the quality of the data that you're getting and the inherent flexibility of the design. And my only point is that you can make these decisions deliberately. So just to quickly review the bit, and then I will shut up, I promise. Right. So the basic issue is I'm trying to convince you that given all of the criteria that you use in deciding what the design is going to be, add this issue of unintended consequences to the mix. Don't make it the only one, but at least throw it into the mix. All right, we have this notion that there is a continuum from foreseeable to truly unforeseeable. I tried to explain that that's not really true, but it's true enough to understand what's going on. And there are different methodologies that you can use along these continuum, there's only one. And all this advice is good advice, except using anything involves some opportunity cost, which is why you need to think about other things as well. And after that, we gave a bunch of examples. So it's time, I guess, for me to shut up. If people have questions.